Hi everyone, this is Meg at Chasing Retro, and I am going to give you sort of a loose, not really tutorial, but just guide of how I sew on paper. I'm going to start out with some basic sewing tips that I have learned along the way, and then I'm going to go more specifically into tips for just sewing on paper and techniques and things surrounding that. So before I get started, I wanted to offer a disclaimer up to you guys. I am not a professional sewist. I never claim to be. I've never had any formal instruction. The only instruction I've had is number one, taught to me by my mom, and number two, self-taught, and that includes reading books and watching videos. I have been sewing with help from my mom getting started since I was about 12. It started because I wanted to make dollhouse linens, blankets, pillows, things like that for my dollhouse and my Barbie house. My mom said, why don't you make your own? And she is a sewer, and so she already had a lot of fiberfill and fabric and thread and just let me have at it. And she taught me a few things to get going, and I ran with it. When I found junk journaling, I realized I can still sew, but I can sew on paper. And if you're a junk journaler, you know that paper is, to me, easier to sew on because unlike fabric, it doesn't move around on you as much, and it's more exact and it's more visible, and it's just a lot of fun. So these are things that I'm going to show you today that have worked for me over the years and with the machines that I have chosen to use in my sewing room. It may be completely different for you. You may have a completely different type of machine. This is just what I am using in my own little world, and I wanted to show it to you in hopes that it would give you some ideas and inspiration on how you can make your sewing not as scary if you're starting out, and maybe even more fun if you're used to sewing. The first thing I wanted to talk about is the type of sewing machine. Personally, I prefer the brand Brother, and this is a personal preference. I've only sewn on 3 machines. One is a Kidmore, which was my mom's. One is a Singer, which was my very first sewing machine. And then I've had 2 Brothers at this point. One model, I guess the intro model, and then I was given this for a birthday gift from my husband 2 years ago. And I have named him Ryan Gosling because he's always asking me, what do I want when I sit down? And when I say that, I mean stitches. There's a lot of stitches on this one, way more than I will ever need. But I bought this one, and I chose this one because it is a quilting machine, and because of that, it has not only a lot of stitches, and it also has extra stitches and ability to write letters up here. It has an extendable platform that is fully removable. It's very easy to snap on and off. This is the model number of this one if you're interested. And there are sales routinely that come up that I see. But yeah, I chose this one because my Singer that I had, nothing against Singer, I think that's the standard in the sewing machine world, or was for many years. I was having trouble with it coming, the thread coming out of the needle repeatedly. Not only that, it was very difficult to re-thread the needle even with the little mechanism they provided. This one is like a breeze. It is so easy to put the thread back in the needle and to do all of the things, including refill bobbins. It's just so much faster and easier for my opinion. Also, the Singer that I had was labeled or marketed to be a workhorse. In reality, it would not sew through what I would assume would be some of the lightest materials that I would have used in junk journaling. I don't think it would have made it through a layer of fabric, fiberfill, chipboard, another layer of fiberfill and fabric without really struggling. This one works like a charm. This is a true workhorse machine. That being said, you do need to be sure that you keep health of your machine, because as junk journalers, we put our machines through a lot of rigorous sewing. So we need to make sure that our needles stay sharp and our machine stays clean. The type of needles that I use for sewing paper are just the universal 80-12. A lot of people like to use heavy-duty material needles, such as jean needles and things like that. If you did a lot of sewing on faux leather And vinyl, absolutely, you probably do need that type of needle, but I have only broken 2 needles in 2 years. And so I would say that 80-12 works for me. They're also the easiest to find, and in my case, I usually find them to be a little cheaper, especially if I buy them in bulk. To clean the machine, so most newer machines self-oil. They have closed oiled compartments, so you don't have to routinely go in and you don't have to buy the sewing machine oil. If you have a vintage machine, you do, and you need to watch videos on how to do that. This one has a closed system, so all I do, probably after every journal project that I finish, I will take this off, and it comes with a key, but I usually just use a coin. This plate comes off, and I clean out the inside of it with a mini vacuum, tweezers, very fine tip tweezers like these, and a paintbrush, a dry, coarse paintbrush. And I get all of the lint and things like that out that I can, and there are videos showing you how to clean and what parts to clean and what parts not to touch, so you won't risk damaging them. But I do clean mine after every project, which is about once a month. That may be a little overkill, but I do not want to be responsible for my machine binding up with lint and dying early. As far as feet goes, for sewing on paper, the standard foot that comes with the machine is just fine. If your machine has extra stitches and you put it on one of those special stitches, in my case, it's the higher numbered ones, it will change right here from J to N or M or whatever type of special foot it needs to do that stitch. And my machine and most machines come with those special feet. You just have to put them on. This machine, New Brothers, have a very easy system for replacing feet. There's just a little lever in the back. The foot drops out, you pull it out and snap the new one in. It's amazing. But I know other machines are possibly a little more involved. For sewing on things that are sticky, like vinyl, leather, sometimes we have, some papers that are a little more glossy. If you find that your machine starts to stick, I was just given this tip recently, and I am so glad that I was, because for only $6 on Amazon, I bought a 2-pack Teflon foot and a roller foot. This one is what it sounds like. It's made out of Teflon, and it glides right across very sticky materials. And this one, again, is what it sounds like. It rolls across things that are a little harder to glide over easily. Both of these work great, and if you have an extra $6, I suggest getting those for your sewing drawer. I did mention earlier that I have broken 2 needles. I think with the standards of safety that machines are made with nowadays, it's not as much of a risk to ourselves when a needle does break. For instance, both times mine broke, they broke cleanly in the middle, but the thread was still attached to the eye of the needle, so the needle bottom, the sharp end, stayed where it was, did not come toward me or anything like that. However, I go the extra mile. I wear reading glasses because I have to see up close, and I always make sure I'm wearing those when I'm sewing, just in case something were to come flying toward me when a needle breaks or some other random thing happens when I'm sewing. I have my eyes protected at least partly by a reading glasses. I don't think you need to go wear safety glasses, but in my case, I feel safer with my reading glasses on when I'm sewing. For sewing on most paper and fabric, this is the tension wheel. I keep my tension almost always right on 3. Some people go a little bit higher for 3.5 if they find that their stitches are a little bit weak. On the back, maybe there's a little bit of gap in the back bobbin thread, but that's for most cases. I have found that 3 works just fine for me. Though my machine has all of these really cute, adorable stitches, I really only use 2 of them most days, and that's the straight stitch and the zigzag stitch. And you can probably find a machine under $100 that has both of those stitches, and you'll be just fine. You can adjust the width of the stitch and the height of the stitch electronically on this machine, but on other machines there may be a manual wheel that you turn or some other way to set the setting. But when you first turn the machine on, if you have a brother, the recommended stitch settings are almost always going to be what shows on the screen, and you can change them from there. So this is exactly what it says. This is the width. This is how far apart the needle goes when it goes in from one side to the next hole going forward. The height of the stitch is how wide your stitch is going to be on the fabric or paper. And I've made this little handy dandy card to show you. This is an example of how very different this same zigzag stitch looks with different widths and height. So this one is the one that the machine automatically puts it on when you turn it on, and it's probably the one that you'll use most likely if you're going to do appliques, which I'll show in a moment. But for just sewing around the edges of tags, I don't do anything this tight. Not only is it not really necessary, it does use more thread as well. So I will usually use something around here. Occasionally on a very large card, I will do something like that. But for sewing down something one layer to the other and you don't want any gaps, the best thing to do is to go closer together. Some of you might be asking, how in the world do I learn how to sew straight? Well, I'll say two things. Number one, that's what these stitching guides are here for. These lines right here are really seam allowance lines, but to me, they're guidelines. If I know exactly where I want the stitch to fall in regards to how close to the edge of the card or page I'm going to sew, I start sewing and then I make sure that I stay on whatever line, put the edge of the page on whatever line that is lining up to keep this needle where it needs to be. For snippet strips or something like that that's, 3 feet long but only 3 inches wide, start sewing, make sure it lines up with, say, a 1/2 inch line, and you can just put it on very fast speed and just go, because all you're really watching is this right here to make sure the fabric stays with this line. Now, my machine does not have a little warning letting me know my bobbin's about to run out. So sometimes you'll be just zipping along and then realize, oh, I haven't been sewing for the past 2.5 minutes because my bobbin thread ran out. That's just sort of something that you just have to gauge as you go. When you are about to start a large sewing length, just do a little peek and check your bobbin. If it looks like it might be getting low, go ahead and switch it out. That way you won't have to go back and try to figure out where you left off and waste a lot of time that way. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to just utilize here what's given to you. It is a lot easier to stay on track if you know exactly where your fabric needs or your paper needs to be. The second thing that I'll say is a lot of it just comes with practice. When I first started sewing, oh my goodness, my lines looked like a curvy road through the mountains. It was awful. The more I sew, I find the easier it is for me to keep a straight line, sometimes not even paying as much attention to this as I did before. Practice, 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 and repetition will help you learn to make straighter stitches and have a more finished look. One more thing I wanted to say about the recommended stitch width and length that comes onto the machine. Know that these recommended settings are ideally for fabric. So just because it's the best setting for this particular stitch design to be sewn onto fabric, that may not work for paper. And by that I mean, as you know, paper is a pulpy material, and if the needle goes in and out too close together in a succession line, then what will happen? You're basically going to create sort of a punch out with your sewing, and so you're sewing along and then you take it out of the machine, you realize that you just created a perforated design, and the minute you touch it, your paper perforates and falls apart. So I recommend getting a few scraps of paper next to your machine. If you want to try a new stitch, try it on the scrap. If it looks like that it is compromising the strength of the paper, and if you were to sew it that way, then the decorative flower border you put on the edge, when you pull your paper out, the edge of the paper is going to fall off. Maybe you need to adjust the settings a little bit. I learned this the hard way, unfortunately, with some pages that were already sewn into a journal. So don't do that. Always practice first if you're doing a new stitch to make sure you have an adequate height and width between your stitches so that your paper won't become a perforated edge. All right, I'm going to show you 2 examples of how I sew applique style, which is where you put an image or an object on top of another layer and sew around it to sew the edges down. This is an example of a applique card that I have just cut a piece of fabric and glued it with glue stick down to a journaling card. So I'm going to go around this, and it's not a perfect curve. It's definitely not a straight line. So I'm just going to move slowly, turning the card as I go. And if there's a little bit of a point where I need to make a sharper turn, I'll show you what I do at that point to make sure that it doesn't get a little bit too crazy when I make that turn. So I always start out, if I don't start with, I always end with a back stitch, which my machine has a backwards button. Maybe yours doesn't. You can always rotate the wheel backwards if you need to do that manually, but that just makes sure that the thread will not back itself out of your project later. It's more important on paper than it is on fabric because paper doesn't grab the thread as well as fabric will. I usually try to start at the bottom of an image, and I have my sewing machine set on the recommended settings for zigzag applique, which is 1.4 width, 3.5 height. Lower the foot down, and I can see where the needle is going to come down, which is on the left side of this little opening in the foot. So I'm putting it right where it will hit on the fabric, and then it will move over and hit the card on the other side. All right, I'm going to pause it right here and show you that this curve coming up here, though it is not a really sharp curve, I'm going to pretend that it is so that I can show you what I do when I get to a point where I need to make a sharper turn. I'll do 1 or 2 stitches at a time, such as this, and then I will lift the presser foot up, rotate the paper ever so slightly, and put it back down, and do a couple more. Do the same thing over and over until you've gotten past that tricky part of the curve. Sometimes you may only need to do 1 stitch instead of 2 before you turn it again. All right, I'm past the tricky part, so I'm going to increase my speed to come on around and meet the other thread. And I am going to do a back stitch here to make sure that my thread is completely closed off in a very neat and tidy way, and it will not unravel. Lift the needle and release it and check our work. So as you can see, it is all the way around, very clean. It's grabbing the edge of the fabric and the paper. And I think this width is perfect for applique. Honestly, I could probably go a little bit wider, maybe 1.6 by 3.5. We'll try that on the next one. This is an example of one of my TV cards. I have a tutorial on how I make these. It's nothing fancy. It just looks like an image is on a TV set. So I offset it just a little bit. It'd be fun to add some TV buttons on one side, but this is just straight and then a curve and then straight and then a curve. So I'm doing the same thing as I did last time, but I'm going to increase my stitch width just a little bit. And I did a little back stitch to finish it. And there you have it. Now you can do an outline of paper onto cardstock or fabric onto paper with a straight stitch as well, but I just wanted to show you what the zigzag looked like. Typically for a straight stitch, if I'm sewing something down to a card, I'll use the length 3.5. If it's a very large card, I might go up to a 4 width. And if it's a very, very tiny tag, I'll probably go down to even as small as a 2.5. Before I go, I have a few other tips to share with you that don't really require a visual aid. I'll just go through them quickly. Number 1, know that sewing on paper will dull your needles faster. This is just the way it is. It's because of the friction, probably. Make sure you change your needles a little more often than is recommended for sewing on fabric. And always change your needle before you're sewing a garment or some other fine, delicate material after you have been sewing on paper. You will really see how dull your needle has become if you do not do so. Next, do not sew on wet glue. This is sort of an obvious thing, but liquid glue that seeps out of the edge of your project while you're sewing can get into your machine and possibly ruin it. Even glue sticks can bind up a machine if you're a heavy glue stick applier. I would recommend letting glue dry at least 2 minutes, maybe even 5, before you take it to the machine. One of the ways that I do this is when I'm gluing images onto cards that I need to sew, I will glue a bunch, say 15 or 20, and I'll pile them up next to me. And then I'll pick up the whole stack, flip it over, and I'll start with the one on the bottom, which has had the most time to dry. Next tip, never sew on washi, and this also includes mailing tape. So I did sew on mailing tape when I made the glitter tape a few weeks ago, which I had a tutorial on my channel. I ended up having to clean my needle. So if you ever have that happen, if your needle becomes gummed up by sewing on washi tape or through washi tape or mailing tape, make sure you have a product called Goo Gone in your arsenal. I keep mine under the kitchen sink. Take your needle out, get a cotton ball, and clean the needle thoroughly. That stuff works really well, but it does not smell good and it leaves a very oily residue. So be sure you wash your needle after cleaning it as well. Next, cotton fabric, cotton-based paper, and vintage thread creates more dust and lint. So if you use any of these things or all 3 of those together, know that you're going to have more lint and dust collect in your machine than you would otherwise. I am all about sewing with vintage thread. Yes, it may break a little more often, but there's just something about saving vintage thread, even faded vintage thread, from being thrown away. And to me, the trade-off is worth it. Knowing that I have vintage thread in my vintage inspired projects, even though I have to clean my machine more often. I also do use new thread, but honestly, I do really love the vintage cotton and even the polyester. When you're sewing things like clusters, fabric especially, it helps to put the flatter items on the top and the meshier, looser layers of lace or gauzy fabric that might get bound up in the machine with a thick cluster. Put those in the middle of your cluster, not on the bottom and not on the top. That will allow you to use lots of really interesting textures in your sewing without having to worry about it getting stuck in your machine in the little teeth below your presser foot. If you don't know when you're first starting exactly how your machine works and where the needle will come down for this first stitch hole, rotate the knob on the side of your machine to place the needle to start. I did this all the time when I first started, and it's totally okay to do that. After a while, you'll get a feel of where your machine needle starts for each stitch type, and you don't have to do that anymore. You can sew chipboard or thin cardboard if you are very, very careful to go slowly, or better yet, like I said at the beginning, use a thicker, more heavy-duty needle. I have sewn journal covers together with, like I said, a layer of cotton batting, fabric, sometimes even thick fabric, and chipboard. sandwiched together in a layer of 5, and it is done wonderfully. You just have to go slowly and don't push your machine past its limits. You will know, your machine will start making noises that lets you know, I'm a little bit stressed out. I need you to back off. So far, my brother has not really done that yet, but I have had machines that did. And so you might want to rethink your project scope if that begins to happen to you on a regular basis. My last tip for you guys is to stack up and sew all at the same time. Sewing can be hard on your neck and your back and your shoulders and even your eyes if you're over 40 like me. So stack up a project pile next to you. It also keeps you from going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and wasting very precious time. Stack up a pile next to you and make sure that your sewing chair is at a proper height so that your arms are not way above your shoulders, or you're not having to bend way down and hunch for a long, long time. Make sure you're comfortable, make sure you have your projects within reach, and you'll be able to fly through them and realize how much more you can get done in one day if you batch your sewing projects together. Guys, thank you for joining me today. If you're new here, welcome. I hope you'll stick around and watch some of the other things that I've been doing and get creative with me. You guys have an awesome day. See you soon.